Good evening, Dom. I decided to share this story because it made me reconsider simple choices, like taking a work shift during unusual hours. A friend of mine spent some time working at a 7-Eleven convenience store here in Monterrey, Mexico. For those who don't know, these stores are open 24 hours a day and offer basic and practical items. A few weeks ago, while I was job hunting and exploring possibilities, I decided to ask him about his experience working there, as I needed something that would fit my schedule so I could continue studying. He mentioned that it was indeed a good option in that sense, as long as it was at a quiet location. Let's call him Tommy to protect his identity. He worked at a store near the Tec de Monterrey, more specifically on Luis Elizondo Street. Tommy often said that the atmosphere at that branch was very pleasant. At the time, the pandemic had just started, so it was not very busy. There were almost no lines, and customers only appeared sporadically. Additionally, it was a safe area, with no reports of robberies in the previous 2 years. During a conversation at my house, I mentioned that I was interested in the night shift, as it fit perfectly into my routine. At that moment, Tommy became serious, took a deep breath, and after a pause, shared something that seemed to trouble him. He explained that after several months on the job, the night shift employee suddenly quit without any notice. The manager, having no other option, asked Tommy to take over that shift. Although hesitant at first, he worked the night shift for about a month, and to his surprise, the experience was smooth. There was less activity, which made the work much lighter, and the only occasional challenge was dealing with suppliers. Tommy even began to enjoy the shift, especially because he received a bonus. Neither he nor I are easily spooked or scared, and paranormal topics have never really affected us. However, Tommy said that something out of the ordinary happened one specific night. It was around 4 in the morning, and he was sitting there distracted by his phone, enjoying the calm of the shift. Suddenly, he heard a loud noise, as if someone had slammed their hand on the counter right in front of him. The sound made his heart race. When he looked up, he was petrified to see a thin, almost skeletal hand emerging from dark, dirty rags that reeked of a terrible stench of decay. He could barely breathe as he noticed that behind those tattered clothes there was something resembling a human figure. Despite the store's bright lighting, he couldn't see any eyes on that thing's face. Just black, deep holes on a blank visage that simply stared at him. Finally, regaining movement, Tommy stumbled backward awkwardly, knocking over cigarettes and other items that were neatly arranged behind him. Some products scattered on the floor, but he couldn't take his eyes off the thing standing in front of him. The only thought in his mind was trying to understand how something so strange had entered the store without him hearing the small bell attached to the door. All of this happened in a matter of seconds. What was, until then, an expressionless face began to change slowly. The creature's mouth, which had been slightly open, started forming a smile. But it wasn't a normal smile. It stretched unnaturally, almost reaching from ear to ear, something that seemed impossible for any human being. Desperate, Tommy tried to grab his phone to call the police. Meanwhile, that thing began moving toward the counter's entrance. But the movement was bizarre. It didn't seem to walk, but rather slide or float, never breaking eye contact with him. With trembling hands, Tommy dialed the number as quickly as he could. However, when he glanced away for a brief moment to look at his phone screen and then looked back up, he realized the thing had vanished. There was absolutely nothing in front of him anymore. Then the sound of the doorbell echoed through the store, signaling that someone had just entered. He quickly stood up, looking for something behind the counter to defend himself with, but what he saw were 2 young men who had just walked in. The boys, noticing Tommy pale and visibly shaken, instinctively stepped back. Maybe they thought a robbery was happening. But with the little strength he had, Tommy asked for help. They called another friend who was waiting in the car, and the 3 of them entered the store. Tommy tried to explain, still in disbelief, that something or someone had appeared there without him noticing. Perhaps it was a homeless person trying to scare him, he suggested. The young men decided to call the police. When the patrol arrived, they searched the store and the surrounding area but found nothing unusual. Tommy, on the other hand, called his manager, begging him to come to the store. The manager, however, upon hearing that it wasn't a robbery or vandalism, didn't see it as a priority and only showed up at 6 in the morning. While waiting, Tommy decided to lock up the store completely, feeling a little safer as the first rays of sunlight appeared on the horizon. When the manager finally arrived, they reviewed the security footage. There were two cameras, one pointed at the parking lot and the other focused on the counter. In the video, you could see Tommy using his phone until, suddenly, he seemed to react to something. He raised his head, stumbled backward, and knocked over the items. But there was nothing beyond that. Nothing showed up on the footage. There was no sign of any figure or presence besides him. The video also captured the young men entering the store and interacting with Tommy. However, the manager noted that everything appeared calm, except for Tommy's frantic reactions. He tried to console him, offered him something to eat, and eventually drove him home. Tommy, however, said he spent the rest of the day unable to relax or sleep. He needed to share what he had witnessed with someone and find some explanation, even though nothing seemed to make sense at that moment. Tommy was shaken all day. Before his next shift, the manager called to say that he could take the day off and stay home if needed. The following day, when Tommy returned to the store, he spoke with the manager, who ended up confessing something disturbing. The previous night shift employee had experienced a very similar incident, which led him to quit without explanation. The manager also said he would completely understand if Tommy wanted to transfer to another store, change shifts, or even resign. But beyond that, there was nothing they could do. It was an unexplainable situation, something beyond everyone's control. Without much thought, Tommy decided at that moment to end his employment. He thanked the manager, left the store, and never took a night shift again anywhere. To this day, he seeks some kind of explanation for what he witnessed that night. As for me, after hearing all of this, I completely gave up on the idea of working at that place. Before we move on to the next story, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to get the latest stories. Your presence means a lot, and your support is essential. All right, let's keep going. This event happened to me in 2020. The world was shutting down because of COVID, and everyone was isolated in their homes. As a backpacking and camping enthusiast, I used the pandemic as an excuse to explore various national parks and camp in different places. One of these destinations was a creek located in Rocky Mountain National Park in the state of Colorado, USA. Without getting into personal details or revealing my identity, suffice it to say that in 2019, something work-related damaged my reputation and made many people hate me. I had to move apartments, change my phone number, and in the end I resigned. The mistake I made caused significant financial losses for some people, so a storm of criticism was inevitable. But I had no idea how far it would go. For a while I received countless abusive messages from unknown numbers. Some were even threatening. I never knew if it was always the same person or a group using different numbers, but I figured it could be someone determined to harass me. Over time this subsided, and I was relieved, thinking they had finally lost interest or moved on with their lives. At that time I was unemployed and focusing on myself. That was another reason to seek refuge in national parks. On one of my trips I drove for about 3 hours to Rocky Mountain National Park. I left my truck in the parking lot and followed a trail on foot that led to the creek. There was absolutely no one there. I believe the lockdown and the fact that it was winter explained the emptiness. The ground was covered with a thin layer of snow that crunched under each step. After some walking, I reached the creek. Despite the cold, it wasn't frozen and flowed calmly. The scene was incredibly serene, a true relief for the accumulated stress in my life. I chose a spot a bit off the trail to set up my camp. I pitched the tent, prepared firewood, lit a fire, and cooked some sausages on my small stove. Later, I sat by the fire to read a book. After reading a few chapters, the day started to darken. Fortunately, I had a headlamp that helped a lot. I rolled a cigarette and began smoking. After a few drags, I felt my phone vibrate. I knew something was wrong right away since, apart from my family, very few people messaged me. I took the phone out of my jacket pocket and saw several messages from an unknown number. My heart raced as I realized it was starting again. The number had a 203 area code, which I looked up and found out was from Connecticut. The messages were unsettling. "How's the camping going, buddy? The view from here is amazing. Now I understand why you came here, I replied immediately. Who is this? If the first message had just been a question about the camping trip, I might have thought it was someone close, maybe a relative. But those messages were strange, as if the person was there with me. And that's when the effect of the weed began to hit hard. I was completely stoned, and my anxiety skyrocketed. I became extremely paranoid. I started spinning in circles, looking in every direction of the forest, which was now almost completely dark. With the feeling of danger intensifying, I opened my backpack and grabbed my P365 pistol. That was my way of feeling safer. Usually I would extinguish the fire before going to bed, but with the level of paranoia I felt, the idea of being completely in the dark was unbearable. I got into the tent, crawled into my sleeping bag, and kept staring at those messages on the phone, waiting for a reply that never came. Minutes dragged on, and I just wanted the weed's effects to wear off. Still wearing my headlamp, I tried to go back to the book I had been reading, but between being high and obsessing over those messages, it was impossible to focus. I decided to watch videos on YouTube to pass the time. Sleeping wasn't an option. Ironically or not, I ended up choosing a documentary about murders, something that, given the circumstances, might not have been the wisest decision. Then, out of nowhere, I received a new message, a response to my question. That doesn't matter anymore, and my heart raced again. I responded immediately. How do you know I'm camping? Once again, silence, no reply. My mind started spinning with 1,000 theories. Could it be a cruel joke by someone close? Or maybe it was one of the people who had harassed me in the past. But if that were the case, how would they know where I was? That was the most unsettling part. Meanwhile, I spent about an hour watching more videos on my phone. I noticed that the fire outside was almost out. The winter forest has an eerie tranquility. No sound of insects, just the wind, when it decided to blow. Each time a video on my phone ended, the silence seemed to scream in my ears. On another occasion, I might have enjoyed this calm, but my peace had already been shattered. Then the silence was broken. I heard footsteps in the snow. Human footsteps. They came closer, stopped about 2 meters from the tent, and stood still. I already had the gun in my hand, my finger ready to unlock the safety. Suddenly, a flash lit up the tent for an instant. It looked like a flashlight or someone taking a photo. Shortly after, I heard the footsteps moving away. Before they completely disappeared, my phone vibrated. It was another message from that number, this time with a photo. The image showed my tent. And then another message came. Sleep well. At that moment, it felt like the weed's effects evaporated. A wave of adrenaline and determination overtook me. I unzipped the tent and fired 2 shots into the air. The sound of hurried footsteps retreating in the snow confirmed it had worked. I had scared the person off. At the same time, it left me even more unsettled. Whoever it was, they were still nearby. I shouted some threats into the void and went back inside the tent. Apparently it worked. I didn't receive any more messages or hear any other footsteps. I stayed awake for hours, unable to relax, feeling as if I had consumed way too much coffee. When exhaustion finally overcame me, I fell asleep. Waking up with sunlight streaming into the tent was an indescribable relief. Whoever had followed me to that place probably didn't imagine I would be armed. I definitely don't fit the profile of someone who carries a gun. And that shot was the first, and to this day, the only one I've ever fired. The person who had been bothering me with messages and following me seemed to have given up as soon as they realized I was prepared to defend myself. Nearly 5 years have passed since then, and I've never been disturbed again. Even so, that night was a true nightmare. I don't even like to think about how things could have ended if I hadn't been armed. It was almost 11 at night when Davy reached out to me. His voice, subdued and hesitant, revealed that he was deeply immersed in sadness. I couldn't turn my back on him. Having faced my own dark moments, I knew how devastating loneliness could be during such times. I suggested we go for some beers to clear his mind. He agreed, but quickly warned that he was completely out of money. Before heading to his house, I stopped at a store and bought the beers, a pack of cigarettes and some snacks. When I arrived, he greeted me with a visibly forced smile and said, Let's go to the backyard, but close your eyes. My house is a mess." Of course, I didn't obey, and I saw that he wasn't exaggerating. The place clearly reflected the inner chaos he was experiencing. Without commenting on it, I simply followed him to the back of the house. The backyard was spacious and shrouded in darkness, with tall trees whose shadows seemed to come alive. Rabbits roamed freely, their movements hard to follow among the bushes. We sat under one of the trees, and Davy began to open up, taking sips of beer. He talked about his financial struggles, how he had been accumulating debt for years and saw no way out. I offered financial help, but he rejected it without hesitation. "I don't want to lose your friendship. I've borrowed money from others, and when I couldn't pay them back, they distanced themselves from me." He fell silent for a few moments, then suddenly said something that caught me off guard. "I have a plan. I read online that elves can help if you leave something for them. That's why I like staying here under this tree. I've seen strange things here. I think they live here. I'll leave candy, alcohol, and cigarettes to win them over." I asked if he really believed in that, and if he was sure about what he was doing. Davy insisted that he had found a detailed ritual on an online forum. I tried to convince him to research more before doing something so unusual, but he seemed determined, calmly smoking as he stared at the tree, nodding subtly. "Maybe you're right, it could be dangerous," he said without breaking his gaze. Time passed, and around 3 in the morning I decided to leave. I hadn't gone far when Davy called me again. His voice was filled with terror. "Come back, please, I'm scared." The call dropped. I rushed back as quickly as I could, fearing the worst since I knew that in his state he might act impulsively. When I arrived, Davy was in a panic, sweating, trembling, his eyes wide with fear. "What happened?" I asked, trying to calm him down. He pointed with a shaking hand toward the backyard. "Look, but don't make a sound." Cautiously, I approached the window. At first, I saw nothing but the trees swaying in the wind. But then I heard it. Voices whispering Davy's name, drawing out each syllable in a disturbingly inhuman way. He clutched my arm, terrified. I made a pact. I left candy, cigarettes, alcohols, and they spoke to me. When I ran, they screamed at me with indescribable fury. I asked if he had taken anything, but he vehemently denied it. Before he could continue, a piercing sound shattered the silence, harsh voices, like those of old men, calling Davy's name from the tree. There were many disordered, each word dripping with malice. Davy stood frozen, staring out the window, while I crouched on the floor, too petrified to risk a glance. "They're there," Davy murmured. "So many. What do I do?" Before I could respond, he collapsed unconscious. I tried to lift him, but his body was as heavy as stone. The voices grew closer, and the sound of footsteps crushing leaves filled me with dread. I grabbed my phone to record everything, but it shut off on its own. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the previous noise. Desperately, I shouted that Davy was unconscious, pleading for them to leave him alone and go away. A few minutes later, Davy woke up. To my surprise, he was eerily calm. He told me to leave, assuring me that he knew what to do. I tried to convince him to come with me, but he refused with unsettling serenity, claiming that reading Psalm 91 would be enough. Apparently, he had relied on it before. A few weeks later, I saw him at a restaurant. He was unrecognizable, dressed in elegant clothes with new tattoos, exuding confidence, almost arrogance. He seemed happy. He wasn't alone. A stunning woman accompanied him. Later, he called me and said life was great and that he owed it all to his rabbits. He then sent me a photo of the animals. They were under the same tree, sitting like people, holding cigarettes in their mouths with expressions that were almost human, something sarcastic and eerie. A shiver ran down my spine as I saw it. I asked what it meant, and he explained that they communicated with him through the rabbits. He said the animals were like messengers, and that, bizarre as it seemed, he wasn't afraid. According to Davy, the offering he had made had been accepted, and now everything was better. Before ending the call and blocking me on all social media, he left me with one last sentence. "With them by my side, things will only get better." Months later, I heard about his death. He was found in his backyard, dead from a heart attack, while the rabbits were devouring his body. Since then, I can't forget what happened under that tree or the shadows Davy saw. Sometimes in my nightmares, I hear the same voices from that night calling my name. If you're enjoying the stories, don't forget to leave a like. It really makes a difference. Okay, let's continue. When I was a child, my family had an annual tradition. Every October, we would take a trip to northern Michigan, USA. We would pick a weekend and gather at my Uncle Roger's property, which spanned about 4 acres. The big house he kept there was spacious, with 5 bedrooms and 3 bathrooms, perfect for accommodating everyone. 2 of the bedrooms were reserved for the kids. My brother and sister shared one, while our 4 cousins stayed in the other. The adults took the remaining rooms. Uncle Roger was an avid hunter and fisherman. He frequently traveled to camp and hunt in various parts of the country. My father joined him a few times, though he didn't like the idea of harming animals. He was the kind of person who wouldn't hurt a fly. Uncle Roger's property included a vast forest area, marked by trees painted with red paint, indicating the property line. Beyond that lay the county forest, with miles of isolation until the nearest house, or so it seemed. One day, while we were having lunch and the adults were talking about hunting, my brother Kevin, our cousins Jack and Henry and I, came up with the idea of spending the night camping in the woods. To our surprise, our parents agreed. They had already had a few drinks, which certainly helped them say yes. Our mothers weren't too happy about it, but they didn't outright forbid it either. So, my dad and Uncle Roger took us out into the woods with a tent. Only the boys were part of the adventure. My sister and my girl cousins decided to stay at the house. The hike felt long, or at least it did to Henry, the youngest of the group, who quickly started complaining. Our dads laughed, as they always did when they were together, especially after drinking. I, being 13, was the oldest. Kevin and Jack were around 10, and Henry, the youngest, was about 9. We went past the property line to a small clearing my uncle called the Deer Beds. He explained that it was an area covered with soft moss, perfect for camping. He had used the spot before. There, our dads gave us a somewhat clumsy lesson on how to set up the tent. Of course, we had to help, no standing around and watching. The tent was big enough for 4 kids, and we each laid out our sleeping bags inside. We finished everything before dark, as it would have been much harder at night. Back at the house, we played outside until dinner time. During the meal, our mothers reiterated that the idea didn't seem safe, saying we were too young to stay alone in the woods. But our dads assured them everything would be fine. I even remember my dad joking that we'd be close enough for them to hear our screams if anything went wrong. When night fell, they escorted us back to the tent, carrying flashlights and extra blankets since the nights were chilly. I also brought a deck of Uno cards, thinking it would be a good way to pass the time. Once we settled in the tent, my dad and Uncle Roger left us alone. And there we were, 4 boys in the middle of the woods. Although our parents had said we weren't far from the house, the truth was different. There were no lights or sounds from the house. We were immersed in the darkness and silence of the forest. We spent quite some time playing Uno, maybe 30 minutes or more. The game was perfect for keeping us distracted, and the atmosphere inside the tent, lit by our flashlights arranged in a circle, felt cozy. Everything was fine until we heard a distant scream. It sounded like a girl's voice, which froze us in place. We looked at each other, confused and tense. I remembered that foxes could make screams that sound like human voices, and mentioned it to reassure the others. It worked, though I could tell Henry was still visibly shaken. We went back to playing, and I won nearly every round. Nobody brought up the scream again, as if pretending it hadn't happened would make it go away. But then, the sound came again, louder this time and much closer. Now it sounded unmistakably human. We froze again, and this time even I felt the fear creeping in. Henry was on the verge of tears. I decided we should turn off the flashlights. We crawled into our sleeping bags and stayed completely in the dark. None of us wanted to risk running back to the house. The fear of drawing attention with the sound of our footsteps was greater than the fear of staying put. Fragile as it was, the tent felt like our only protection. The silence returned, but not for long. We whispered to each other, trying to guess if the sound could really have been a fox. I admitted I wasn't sure, though I hoped it was. Then we all heard it at the same time, the sound of quick footsteps crunching dry leaves heading straight for us. The footsteps stopped abruptly right outside the tent. And then the scream came. High-pitched, terrifying, like that of a woman. The tent began to shake violently and our screams filled the air. Jack and Henry were screaming in terror while Kevin and I shouted commands. "Get out of the tent!" I unzipped it as quickly as I could and we all bolted toward the house, illuminating our path with flashlights. It was the most desperate run of my life, with the constant feeling that something could grab us at any moment. We screamed the entire way, and when we reached the property we saw our parents already outside, alarmed by our cries. We told them what had happened, the sounds, the shaking tent, the fear. From the shocked expressions on their faces, I realized something. My cousins Emily and Angela, along with my sister, weren't outside. I shouted, accusing my dad and Uncle Roger of sending one of them to scare us, but they insisted the girls were already asleep. That's when it became clear. Someone, a stranger, had been in the woods. The adults grabbed their rifles and went out to investigate, but they came back empty-handed. The next morning we dismantled the tent and brought everything back to the house. That was the first and last time we ever camped in those woods. After that, we never played outside at night again. Who would dare after an experience like that? To this day I have no idea who or what was out there, nor why they did what they did. But whatever it was, I'll never forget that night. For years, I worked at a well-known commercial company holding a cleaning position. At the time, I was 19 years old, and although my shift was during the day, I often heard nighttime employees talking about strange events. They said things appeared out of nowhere, voices echoed in the parking lot, in the basements, and even in the bathrooms. These stories were always told casually, almost like workplace legends, and I had never witnessed anything myself since my routine always involved other people being around. As time went on, I was asked to take care of the bathroom area, which had a peculiar L shape. To enter, you had to push a heavy door, walk down a narrow hallway, and at the end, turn right, where there was a huge mirror about 3 meters long. The sinks were equipped with sensors, the toilets were directly opposite the mirror, and the stalls had sliding locks. Everything seemed quite ordinary. One Saturday, due to a staff shortage, I agreed to cover the night shift along with some colleagues. The building was practically empty. Besides us, there was only the security guard on the ground floor. The night went by quietly. We completed our tasks, and when it was time to finish, we needed to go downstairs to store the cleaning supplies. I realized that one colleague I had a good relationship with hadn't come down yet, so I went to look for her. I found out she was on the upper floors, cleaning the bathrooms. I climbed the stairs to find her, but when I got there, there was no sign of her. I decided to check the bathrooms to let her know it was time to leave. When I opened the door to one of the larger bathrooms, I noticed it was completely dark. Something odd, as the lights were only turned off when the cleaning was finished. I assumed she wasn't there, but just as I was about to close the door again, I heard the sound of the faucets turning on, and immediately after, one of the toilet stall doors slammed shut with force. I didn't stick around to find out more. I ran to the ground floor as fast as I could. I found my friend already downstairs. We couldn't understand what had happened that night. Although we never discovered what caused it, I couldn't help but remember the rumors the night employees used to talk about. The Atlantic University is located in an area where intense heat mixes with the winds coming from the coastline. For over 70 years, it has been a reference point for knowledge, but also for scandals. Founded decades ago, its history carries a dark episode. In the early days of the School of Medicine, as it made strides in pharmacology, its journey was also marked by terrible practices. Disturbing stories began to surface. Vulnerable people such as homeless individuals and local scavengers would disappear without explanation. Reports claimed they were lured to the campus with promises of help or meals, only to fall victim to inhumane experiments. The truth came out when a survivor, beaten and near death, escaped and revealed the horrors he had witnessed. Over 80 bodies were found in clandestine graves. Some were dismembered, others sold for medical practices. Police confirmed that the facts were even more horrifying than the rumors suggested. Over time, it seemed that these episodes were left in the past, but students and staff began reporting unsettling sensations: shadows in the hallways, anguished whispers at night, and a constant feeling of being watched. "It's the weight of the souls who suffered unjustly here," they said. Among the most chilling accounts is the experience of my uncle, who worked as a night guard at the university about 30 years ago. One night, 2 professors asked for help with a move in the laboratory. Without suspecting anything unusual, he asked a colleague to take his place. Minutes later, terrible screams echoed through the building. Rushing to the scene, he found the professors and 2 other men brutally attacking his colleague with shovels. Terrified, he was threatened with death if he said anything. Fearing for his life, he chose to remain silent. Days later, during his rounds, he reached the anatomy lab. The dimly lit hallway cast sinister shadows on the walls, heightening the tension in the air. Inside the lab, something on one of the tables caught his attention, a human mannequin, in quotes, because it was a real body, skinned, carefully preserved for anatomical studies. A chill ran down his spine as he noticed something disturbingly familiar about the body. Approaching, overcome by a mix of disbelief and horror, he murmured, "It looks like Mauro." The silence was broken by a muffled and grotesque sound, something like a gurgle. Then a hoarse voice laden with pain echoed through the room. "It's me." Frozen in terror, he turned quickly toward the voice. There stood Mauro, or what was left of him. His body was mutilated, skin hanging in shreds, eyes sunken in bloody sockets. Mauro's gaze carried sorrow and a weight of accusation. My uncle tried to scream, but no sound came out. He could barely breathe, let alone move. Mauro extended a bloodied hand, pointing to the body on the table. "That's my body." He spoke in a calm yet eerily unsettling voice. Mauro's figure gradually disappeared before my uncle's eyes, leaving behind an unbearable stench of burnt and rotting flesh. When he finally managed to react, he ran out of the lab, never looking back. That same night, he submitted his resignation and left for a distant city, seeking not only safety but also anonymity. Before leaving, he tried to report the incident to the authorities, but his story was dismissed as the ramblings of a shaken man. The most unsettling detail: the plastinated body remained in the lab. Students claim it is still there, displayed in a glass case as a teaching specimen for anatomy classes, and no one dares ask where it came from. Over time, those grotesque practices finally came to an end. Advances in technology and stricter oversight made it impossible to continue the experiments, coupled with the fact that the corrupt figures who allowed them were no longer in power. This, however, did little to relieve the institution's reputation. The label University of Human Experiments was replaced by another equally chilling, the University of Suicides. Every year, without fail, 5 or 6 students would jump from the 6th floor of Block C, the site of the worst atrocities. The letters they left behind were similar, always conveying a suffering that seemed beyond any logical explanation. But what truly sent chills down the spine were the events preceding these tragedies. Silhouettes gliding along walls, muffled laughter echoing through empty hallways, and the figure of a humanoid creature with enormous wings and a deformed face seen by a few. I myself witnessed one of these cases. It was the 6th that year. A young man threw himself and lay agonizing on the ground for a few minutes. As he struggled for his final breaths, a terrifying figure emerged from the shadows, a giant bird with a horribly distorted face. It landed next to the body and seemed to observe it intently, as if assessing the result of its work. Then, it simply vanished. The sight was horrifying, like staring death in the eyes and seeing it satisfied with its work. Remembering the young man's desperate attempts to breathe fills me with uncontrollable fear and suffocating anxiety. This year so far there have been no victims, but rumors circulate like whispers in the air. It's only a matter of time. The pattern never fails. 5 or 6 students jump, always from the 6th floor, as if an invisible force drives them to the abyss. During my 3 years at the law school, I saw this macabre cycle repeat without interruption. Neither the memorial masses for the victims nor the bright hallway lights seemed able to keep the darkness at bay. The legends grow over time, fueled by new students arriving and hearing the accounts of those who lived through the horror of Block C. This place has become the nucleus of an endless pattern of death, an open wound that seems incurable. Perhaps the Atlantic University is doomed to bear this mark forever, trapped in a cycle where the past keeps returning to haunt the present. The echoes of those who are gone still whisper through the hallways, secrets no one dares to hear. And Block C waits in silence, patient, for the next student who will venture too close to the edge, so the cycle of tragedies can begin again. During a phase of my life, I worked as a night guard in the security booth of a private condominium located in a quiet neighborhood of a large city. My shift, being at night, was usually calm. My main task was to check the cars entering the property, whether they belonged to residents or visitors, and occasionally communicate via radio with my colleagues stationed at the other booth. Everything seemed routine until one specific night, which still sends shivers down my spine just thinking about it. At the same time, I feel a bit embarrassed for letting myself get so frightened. Deep down, we know that night work exposes us to noises and situations that can stir the imagination. But we're supposed to stay calm and not give in to superstitions. And that night, the clock showed around 3 in the morning on a quiet Tuesday. I was watching TV trying to pass the time when suddenly I heard a female voice over the radio, something completely unexpected. Santiago. At first, I thought it was some technical issue, maybe signal interference, but before I could process it, the same voice came through again, clearer this time. That's when I started to feel the first chill. It's important to note that only my colleague and I had access to the radio, and he wasn't the type to play pranks. I grabbed the device and asked who was speaking. On the other side, I heard Fernando, my colleague, calmly responding and asking if I needed anything. I told him it was nothing, that I had probably been mistaken. His calm response reinforced that this wasn't a joke. Even so, something kept making me uneasy. Santiago. Now the voice seemed to come from outside, as if it was close to the booth's glass. Panic overtook me when I started hearing knocks on the door, accompanied by the female voice repeating my name. I won't lie. The fear was so intense that it made me fall out of my chair. I froze completely, unable to react. Still on the floor, I saw the lights of a car illuminating the booth. The presence of that vehicle brought me some relief, because it meant someone was nearby. It was one of the residents, a polite and kind elderly man. He got out of the car, greeted me, and asked if everything was all right. Embarrassed, I admitted I had been scared, but downplayed it, saying it was probably just my imagination. He let out a sigh before telling me something unsettling. This wasn't the first time incidents like this had happened at that hour. According to him, it wasn't just the guards who experienced strange situations, but also residents arriving late at night. They reported seeing an elderly woman, wearing something resembling hospital clothing, standing in the park near the booth. No one knew who she was or why she appeared. The strangest part was that many claimed to see her vanish from the very spot where she stood. The resident mentioned that he had never heard of the woman calling someone by name or approaching the booths. Before leaving, he took a rosary from his car's rearview mirror and handed it to me, saying to hang it on the booth door as he believed it might help. I thanked him, hung the rosary outside immediately, and without hesitation told Fernando everything over the radio. At that point, embarrassment didn't matter anymore. I just needed to share it with someone. When I told Fernando what had happened, he asked why I thought he had never experienced something similar. He explained that ever since he started working there, he had been given a rosary to hang on the door, precisely because of those stories. He said that it had indeed been a long time since anyone mentioned anything about the woman, which might explain why no one had told me to do the same. That ended up being my last night on the job. The voice of that woman echoed in my mind every time I thought about the nights, and I simply couldn't ignore the discomfort it caused any longer. This is a story that left deep marks on my family, still sending shivers down our spines and leaving us with unanswered questions. My name is Bruno, and what I am about to tell happened in 1970 in a small village in Oaxaca, Mexico. It was there that my grandmother Marlene experienced something we have never been able to fully understand. My grandmother was a woman of strong spirit and unshakable determination. She became a widow at a very young age and raised her 3 children, including my mother, on her own. She worked with a hand loom she kept at home, leading a modest life and always repeating that her true wealth was the health of her children. Life in the village, surrounded by mountains and ancient traditions, was peaceful, although filled with mysteries and stories that seemed to dwell in the shadows. It all began on a cool September morning. My grandmother left early for the market, carrying some pieces she had woven to sell. The path to the market was a narrow trail shaded by trees. Many avoided walking there alone, frightened by tales of apparitions, but Marlene was not one to scare easily. That day, as she walked carrying her fabrics, she saw something unusual, a figure sitting under a large, gnarled tree by the path. It was an elderly woman with completely white hair, wearing traditional clothing from the region. She was seated on a small wooden stool with a basket covered by an embroidered cloth in front of her. The woman lifted her face and smiled at my grandmother in a way that, according to Marlene, was both welcoming and unsettling. "Good morning, ma'am," the elderly woman greeted in a firm but serene voice. "Are you heading to the market?" My grandmother, wary, replied that she was on her way to sell her fabrics and asked what the other woman was doing there so early. The old woman kept smiling and explained, "I'm here waiting for those who need help. What is your name?" Marlene hesitated, but eventually told her. The woman nodded slowly, as if savoring each letter, and commented, "Marlene is a strong name. You protect your children, but the paths are not always easy. Trust me, there's always a way forward." These words left my grandmother uneasy, though she couldn't say why. Then the woman leaned forward, opened the basket, and took out a small, round wooden amulet. "Take this," she said. "It will protect you from what cannot be seen but is always around." Despite her suspicion, my grandmother accepted it. There was something in the woman's gaze that made it impossible to refuse. Before Marlene could say anything else, the elderly woman said, "Go on your way, Marlene. We will meet again." At the market, Marlene tried to forget the encounter. She sold her fabrics and returned home around midday. However, that same night, as she prepared dinner, something strange happened. She heard a faint whisper coming from her children's room. She rushed there, but they were sound asleep. She tried to convince herself it was her imagination. The next day, while weaving near the window, the whispers returned, this time clearer. It was a woman's voice, repeating names my grandmother did not recognize. That night, my grandmother decided to place the pendant given by the elderly woman above her children's bed, believing it might protect them. The whispers stopped. However, the next day, as she went out to gather firewood, she saw her again. The woman was sitting in the exact same spot by the path. "Marlene, is everything in order at your house?" the old woman asked, her tone now sounding more serious. "I've heard strange things," my grandmother replied, trying to hide her unease. "Voices whispering names I don't know." The elderly woman nodded with a knowing look and said, "Souls that cannot find rest seek someone who can listen to them. The pendant wards off these presences, but there's something you must do for them. If you don't, they will return." A chill ran through Marlene, who then asked what she needed to do. The old woman responded enigmatically, "You will find out." Without saying anything more, she got up and disappeared among the trees. That night, my grandmother lit a candle in front of the pendant, prayed fervently, and asked for guidance and protection. During the prayer, a vivid image came to her mind, a field full of rustic crosses, as if they were forgotten graves. The vision was so real that Marlene felt short of breath. She understood that there was something hidden that needed to be brought to light. In the following days, Marlene tried to understand what it all meant. The image of the crosses haunted her mind and robbed her of sleep. Determined to find answers, she went back to the place where she always found the elderly woman, but she was no longer there. What she found was the wooden stool left under the old tree. On top of it was an embroidered cloth, similar to the one covering the basket, and a note written in elegant, old-fashioned handwriting. "Seek the land where the forgotten rest. They need their names to be remembered." Though cryptic, the message brought back the vision of the crosses. My grandmother began asking the villagers if they knew of such a place. It was then that Amaro, an elder who had lived there for decades, gave her an important clue. "There's an old cemetery near Arroyo Seco. No one goes there. They say it's where those without family or those who died tragically were buried. Maybe that's what you're looking for." That afternoon, Marlene mustered the courage to go to Arroyo Seco. There she found a forsaken piece of land, overgrown with weeds, practically invisible. It was exactly like the vision. Simple wooden crosses, weathered and many without names, others with inscriptions almost completely faded. The place exuded a heavy sadness, as if time had left deep scars on the land. My grandmother lit the candles she had brought and began to pray aloud, pronouncing every name she could decipher from the crosses. As she did this, a strange sensation filled the air, as if the atmosphere around her grew lighter. Suddenly a murmur arose similar to the whispers she had heard at home, but this time clearer. Thank you, it was the voice of a woman. Marlene looked around, but there was no one there. However, something felt different, as if an invisible weight had been lifted from the place. When she returned to the village, everything was peaceful once more. The whispers had stopped for good, and her home was calm. Still, my grandmother never stopped wondering who the elderly woman was and how she had known so much about what was to come. Weeks later, while heading to the market, Marlene saw the mysterious woman again, sitting on the same wooden stool with the basket still covered by the embroidered cloth. However, something about her was different. She looked younger, and there was a glow about her that made her seem almost radiant. "You've done what needed to be done, Marlene," the woman said before my grandmother could say anything. Speaking their names brought them peace. Now you can move forward without fear. Marlene felt an overwhelming urge to thank her and discover who she truly was. But before she could say anything, the woman raised her hand gently, signaling for silence. "It's not necessary to know. Just remember that sometimes souls seek help in ways we cannot understand. Now go, your children are waiting." As Marlene took a step toward the woman, something extraordinary happened. She vanished, as if she had never been there. The wooden stool and the embroidered cloth were all that remained. My grandmother decided to keep the cloth as a memento of that enigmatic encounter. Over the years, Marlene shared this story with us, always intending to remind us that even in the strangest and most unexplainable situations, there are forces guiding and protecting us. The wooden pendant and the embroidered cloth remain in our family, and every time we see them, we remember the Lady of the Names and the power of giving voice and memory to those who are no longer among us. Before we get to the last story, if you're still here, let me know what time you're watching in the comments. I love seeing who sticks around until the end. Let's not stop now. On to the next. What I'm about to share still makes me question what's real and what's not. It's something I experienced with my father, and even after 2 years, I feel a chill run down my spine when I think about it. I understand if you find it strange. I myself would hesitate to believe it, but I assure you, every detail is true. 2 years ago, my father and I decided to go camping in a remote area in the countryside. We enjoyed these escapes to disconnect from routine. This particular spot had its charm: trails, zip lines, and a bit of a touristy vibe, but it was full of history since it was located on indigenous lands. The first night was peaceful. The campsites were full, campfires were lit, and children's laughter echoed in the air. It was exactly what we had hoped for, a calm and pleasant night. We made hot dogs, roasted marshmallows, drank some beer, and chatted with other campers. It was the perfect setting to relax. On the second night, everything changed. The staff informed us that we would be the only ones in the park since there were no more reservations. At first we thought it was great, an entire place just for us. We spent the day exploring trails, fishing, and enjoying ourselves. At one point we listened to a horror podcast by the river, just to add a touch of suspense to the day, laughing at our own idea. As the sun began to set, we were exhausted from the hike but happy. We decided to head to the park's information center to charge our phones and grab some snacks before returning to the campsite. The walk back was when things started to feel strange. The forest seemed different. The air was heavy, and the sky had an unusual hue, as if dusk had frozen in time. My father commented, "It feels like something's off, like in a weird dream, don't you think?" He was right. The woods seemed endless, and an uneasy feeling overtook me, as though something was watching us. We fell silent, our eyes scanning the surroundings as we walked, alert to every shadow. When we reached the campsite, we sat around the fire, trying to act normal. We avoided mentioning the tension in the air, as if ignoring it would dispel the unease. We roasted more marshmallows, played some music, and even smoked a bit of weed to relax. It wasn't the typical father-son activity, but at that moment, it felt appropriate. Then, around 9 at night, we heard something. A loud crash echoed through the woods like the sound of a tree falling. It was close, maybe about 100 meters away, coming from the direction of the river. We grabbed our flashlights and shone them in that direction, but all we saw was emptiness. No movement, no glint of eyes, nothing. We joked that it might be Bigfoot, but our laughter was more nervous than genuine. Then the sound came again, louder this time, but from a more distant spot. Once again we pointed our flashlights, but the darkness seemed to swallow everything. The trees around us were all we could see. And then came the third crash, much closer this time. That's when real fear set in. Whatever it was seemed to be getting closer, circling the campsite. We didn't have time to think when the fourth noise came, maybe 20 meters away. It was as if a wave of adrenaline hit us. Any effects of the weed vanished instantly. When I looked at my father's face, his wide eyes betrayed the terror he felt. Without needing many words, we agreed that we should get into the tent. In a rush, we threw the remaining wood onto the fire, hoping the flames would keep whatever it was away. Then we ran into the tent, leaving everything behind. I threw myself onto the ground, panting, while my father came in cautiously behind me. But just as he was entering, the loudest crash of all erupted so close that the ground vibrated. He froze for a moment, staring into the darkness. "Dad," I whispered, trying to snap him out of the trance. He finally entered and zipped up the tent, muttering, "There's something standing out there." "What is it?" I asked. "I don't know," he replied, his voice trembling, "but it looked like a wall of darkness." My father positioned himself near the entrance while I tried to bury myself inside the sleeping bag. He held the only thing we had for defense, a small knife. Insignificant, but it was all we had. That's when something almost impossible to describe began, a low vibration, almost like a hum, but it wasn't just a sound. It was a physical sensation, as if the air around us had weight, pressing against our chests and making it hard to breathe. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I just nodded, unable to make a sound. The atmosphere was pure terror, as if we were being watched, hunted. It felt like any wrong move would be fatal. We stayed like that for about 5 minutes until another noise emerged, different from anything we'd ever heard. It didn't sound human or animal. It was something guttural, grotesque, with an alien tone, something I always compare to the roar of a demogorgon. It was simply unexplainable. We froze, glued to the tent floor, barely daring to breathe. Beside me there was a small mesh window, but I couldn't summon the courage to look outside. The fear of being seen was stronger. I stayed there, focused on controlling my breathing while my father gripped the knife tightly. And then the strangest thing happened. We simply blacked out. We don't remember closing our eyes or trying to sleep. When I woke up, it was as if a switch had been flipped. My father still held the knife, and I woke up with my heart racing as though someone was pressing on my chest. My first reaction was to check my phone, but it was dead, despite being fully charged the night before. I asked my father to check his, but it was dead too. We stepped out of the tent to relieve ourselves, but stayed just a few steps apart, back to back, to ensure nothing could sneak up on us. The sky was still dark, as if the night had lingered. The air was still and cold. Everything seemed untouched. The food on the table was undisturbed, and the fire we had stoked was reduced to ashes, as if nothing had approached it. The feeling was that we didn't belong there. We spent the rest of the night in the tent, in almost complete silence, just trying to rest, though not very successfully. When the sun finally rose, we started packing up in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. We didn't exchange a single word until we were in the car, ready to leave that place. It was only on the road, as the tension began to fade, that we talked about what had happened. We discovered we both had the same feeling that night, the clear impression of being watched, hunted, as if something was lurking, waiting for the right moment to strike. When we got home, we told my mom everything, but she just laughed, thinking it was a hallucination, maybe from some drug exposure or strange gas we inhaled. But that wasn't it. Whatever happened that night was real. We both experienced the exact same thing. To this day, we can't understand what it was. We never got a clear look at what was out there. But my father saw something more closely, and he insists it wasn't human nor anything that could be considered natural. Since then, we've searched for stories similar to ours, but we've never found anything that matches what we went through. We also haven't returned to that place or gone on another camping trip. Deep down, I think we know we never will. Hey everyone, thanks for listening. Click the notification bell to stay updated on all future narrations. I post new videos here every day. I hope to see you in the next one. On the screen now, I'm leaving 2 other great videos I know you'll enjoy. See you there.